engaging session. So I will kick us off. My name is Nicola Smith. I am the Regional Partnership Coordinator for Region 6, and I'm a member of the National Ecosystem Services Strategy Team. So we'll begin this session with a little background on this team and the intent of hosting this webinar, and really welcome your feedback on future offerings that we can provide and dialogues that you're all interested in as part of this community of practice. So the Forest Service National Ecosystem Services Strategy Team was chartered by the agency in 2013 and rechartered in 2016 with the primary goal of more formally developing a national strategy and policy around ecosystem services in the Forest Service, and to think about ways to do so operationally in our programs. So the core team convenes every 2 weeks and consists of staff from the National Forest System, state and private forestry, research and development, our headquarters, as well as regions. And we have interdisciplinary participation from folks like Travis, our speaker today, who come from the research and development community, communicators, climate change scientists, economists, planners, partnership folks, to really bring diverse perspectives to how ecosystem services can support our mission and our goals across programs. So our first major deliverable as a team was a general technical report that we published in 2017, identifying ways that ecosystem services can support our work in planning, particularly in terms of understanding the trade-offs of our management decisions, performance, in other words, how are our programs delivering in meaningful terms, and partnerships. So what's the kind of information that we really need both to build partnership platforms and also to build shared investments for restoration and conservation? So we're currently thinking about shared stewardship application of these tools. So how can we apply ecosystem services and our stewardship of resources across all lands? Some climate adaptation lens to performance, and how can we understand the need to manage resilient landscapes from an ecosystem services perspective. Of course, environmental justice, particularly given the current administration's emphasis on that through the Justice 40 initiative, as well as information sharing opportunities like this one, where we can engage in dialogue and hear from all of you. So that's a little background on this team. We really welcome participation from those of you who would like to be more involved or have thoughts about how we can be engaging with your program areas and staff. So before we get into the heart of the matter, which is hearing from Travis today, just a couple of housekeeping items. So if folks wouldn't mind, please muting their mics and keeping video off unless you're speaking or engaging in discussion, just for bandwidth concerns. We'll go through Travis's presentation, and please note your questions in the chat. Members of our team will be pulling themes and tracking those questions. We'll also have a more informal opportunity to pose your questions following Travis's presentation. And before we get to that, I'm going to call on my colleague, Katie Brunson, who has prepared a poll for us to better understand how you currently use watershed and water quality metrics in your work. So this just helps our team better understand how this information is currently being used or could be used in the future. So please just take a minute to check out this poll and give us a sense for how this information might be useful to you.
Nicola, are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Great.
With that, Nicola, should I kick things off? Should I keep going?
Oh, sure. Yes, please. So, Travis, I pulled up a little bio for you, but it's probably more meaningful if you introduce yourself. So feel free to do that. And I'll just add anecdotally that Travis is a great member of our team in terms of understanding from a research perspective metrics that we have available to us in the agency to consider the relationship between watersheds and community and economic development, and also to inform our land management planning. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Travis, but please build out anything in your bio that you'd like to share, and looking forward to your presentation.
Sure, thank you. Yep, if anything happens with video or sound, let me know. I'm an economist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. It's super great to be here. I'm kind of humbled by all the folks that have joined in. I was kind of expecting this to be a small group of people that are often in all the same webinars and settings and meetings that I often attend. So with that in mind, Nicola mentioned that this is meant to be a dialogue. And I think that's really where we want to go. So I'm hoping to present a lot of resources maybe throughout the Forest Service, either from my research or others that I've kind of kept in touch with, or other parts of the agency that are tracking through. So towards the end, yeah, certainly lots of discussion is the hope. I'm going to start with what is probably motivating some of this work on my side. It's probably a pet peeve, maybe a little bit of a confession about the things I hate most about the agency, probably. And I think it's the way that we talk about natural resources, the way we kind of frame our discussion, the way we kind of think about the way we do our jobs, in a way that I think is more draining maybe sometimes than it should be. And to, I guess, to think about what I'm talking about, maybe if you take a moment of your own, kind of mental space and think about what's the one issue that the agency is devoting most of its resources to, right? That tends to be consuming all of our budgets and our time and our mental capacity. My guess is everyone has a relatively common answer. There's certainly a few that stand out. And I don't think it's probably what we went in the agency to do. I remember thinking as a high schooler about what I wanted to be when I grew up, and certainly as an adult of what I want to be when I grow up. And getting involved in natural resource economics, natural resource sciences, when I first started the Forest Service, it was really about these things that I valued, things that I wanted to protect, things that I wanted to fight for. At the end of the day, after spending late nights and weekends and time away from family and all this other stuff, I was hoping at the end of my career to look back and look at a river system, a waterway, something cute and cuddly that might be a stuffed animal on my child's bed, and say, this is here because of my life, right, of my career. It was really kind of this thing that drove me into natural resources, this idea of fighting for something and be able to look back at these values and say, this is here because of me. It's what keeps me going. And when we start talking about things like fire, which is probably where a lot of people were going with that question, that seems to be a discussion about things we're fighting against, or things that we're administratively doing, right? Like we're trying to reach these targets for fuels reduction or whatever. And I get that that's a big part of our daily jobs, of what we kind of get paid to do, but it's not what motivates us. And I think when we tend to fall back on those, what are we fighting against? We get burnt out, we lose track of things. And I'd really like to move the discussion today, and the discussion is the agency, if that ever happens, towards a more discussion about what we're fighting for, that we're doing these things on the landscape, we're doing these management actions because there's things that we value. And I'm completely jealous of like the fish biologists and aquatic ecologists who seem to be devoting their lives towards protecting, a species or a waterway. And I think that's the right mindset. And I really think, I think that's the way to go. And that's why I like economics. That's why I like ecosystem services. I don't know, that's the message that I think I'm going to preach for the next kind of remaining of my career. So hopefully you'll hear a lot, and maybe by the time I retire, we'll all be speaking the language of ecosystem services. Water, it's huge. I'm going to start by framing some of the discussion by why it's important to me. So this little girl in the front of the picture is my daughter. The girl in the back is one of her friends, daughter of someone I grew up with in high school. And I grew up in Louisiana where water and forest and trees were physically in the same space, right? It was hard to talk about the health of waterways without introducing some aspect of trees, right? So it's probably always destined to be where I am today. My fondest memories of a child were spending summers fishing with my dad in Louisiana. A lot of it's bass fishing and pontoon boats, swimming off piers. That sort of kind of lifestyle drove a good part of the way I spent my time and the way I connected with family and the culture of the area and things that were incredibly important to me. I live in Colorado now, so the type of water has changed, but the ideas haven't, right? Like my summers are now spent not on fishing boats, but maybe paddle boards in our lakes, and instead of spinner baits on after bass, I'm often in streams fly fishing. But it's still a big part of my life. And when I think about things that I do, these are the values that come to the forefront of why I get up in the morning and come to the office, or I turn my computer on to engage in these cultural values. I think it's worth fighting for in Louisiana. Certainly we have the world's largest dead zone. We have the country's first climate refugees, history of toxic dumping in our swamps and waterways, an 85-mile industrial corridor known as Cancer Alley, which is sort of frightening to think about. But all those things are important because it's where we spend our time. It's where our human values come from. I've seen firsthand, we all have the consequences of getting land management wrong, or the risk that might be on the landscape. This is a picture taken just a few months after the one of my daughter. So in September of this year, we had, I think a relatively normal, not my area of expertise, but a storm camped out over the mountains outside of Fort Collins and a lot of burned area, and sent a gush of water, a wall of water coming down into a small area with some homes. I volunteer for our county search and rescue. I spent about a week in September looking for the bodies that kind of came out of this. We all know what we're fighting for and the consequences of getting that management wrong. And I think telling that story is important, right? We do what we do because sometimes we like to spend the time on the lake with our kids, and sometimes lives are lost when things go awry. And moving that into a discussion, moving that to the forefront of the way we tell our story, I think has to happen if we're going to be sort of relevant. So everyone can think of their own values, their own happy places. We all have those special places. We all have those things that we value. We have our kids, we have our grandparents, whatever, and that we invest time into. And moving that up into the discussion about why you're here. We have to start talking about them as an agency. They're worth fighting for, and and I think if we don't, then we're likely to lose them. What's the point of both this talk and ecosystem services? This is a conceptual framework of kind of ecosystem services in general. Generally, as an agency, this is my bias point as an economist, we focus too much on the left side of this picture. We focus on management actions. We're an agency full of ecological scientists and practitioners, folks that are really, I guess, embedded on that side of this. Sometimes we talk about human activities. And God forbid socioeconomic outcomes are completely underrepresented, in my view anyway, in the agency. And what we need to do is move as far as we can down to that right side of this slide. We need to start talking about mental health, traditional uses, water treatment costs. If for no other reason, then it's the only way that we can really fulfill objectives like Justice 40. How do we know if we're reaching underrepresented populations, or if we're serving minority or low-income communities, if we don't address the socioeconomic parts of it? So maybe you're tuning in today because, well, now we're sort of legally required to do it, and maybe we'll give you a little bit, some tools towards we get moving towards that goal. Water is huge. It's crazy to have a webinar on it. I've seen a webinar on water. Hopefully we'll have a lot more down the road, but like you said, this is an intro to the conversation. There's generally two ways we think about water. How much is there? How good is the water? That how much is there might be a discussion of climate change, drinking water, in-stream flow, timing of runoff, that sort of stuff. How good is the water? Discussions about water quality, watershed health, threats to water, right? So this is roughly how the talk will be broken up today. How much water is there? I would say that we are relatively good at measuring it, and people in the agency who I saw kind of join in the chat are much better at it than I. So I'm the water specialist for a group called for a project called the Resource Planning Act Assessment. So every 10 years we do large assessments on the renewable resources. So if you're looking for some of these results or some of this data, it will be kind of in the RPA assessment website. You can just Google RPA assessment, US Forest Service, and it will be there. But we talk about water because it's core to our agency's mission. It was there when we first kind of came and were founded or created. And it matters because all of our all of our states, our stakeholders are somehow connected with it. And we're an all land agency mission, or at least on a large part what we do is engaging the all land part of it. In the East, forests are a huge part of where we get our water. In the West, a little bit maybe less on a total area served, but certainly the national forests are a bigger part of that. So we do this because, because we have a lot to say. We have a lot to say about the impact of our water resources. Here's some results that are soon to come out in the 2020 RPA assessment, looking at climate change. So a bit of terminology. This shows results for precipitation across two RCPs, which are sort of relative strengths of climate change. So RCP 8.5 stands for relative concentration pathways, is a sort of a stronger climate change effect or impact than maybe RCP 4.5. And you see the host of models, wet, warm, mid, hot, dry, are the models that were used in this iteration of the RPA assessment. And we know it's getting hotter and drier. This is kind of what a lot of our future looks like in the lands that we manage. So resources, if everyone, yes, these days is engaged more than we've been in the past on climate change assessment. So if you're looking for resources, certainly the RPA assessment is a nice place to start. Otherwise, you probably have at the various research stations kind of local contacts. One great resource, if you haven't ever been there, is these national forest climate change maps. So if you just Google that, this will pop up. It's a website or a suite of tools anyway, put out by folks at RMRS, the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and the Office of Sustainability and Climate. And they're super great. There's a story map that talks about climate, what it might mean for your forests, and it leads you through a set of drop-down menus and ends up producing maps like this, which I absolutely love. I think these are fantastic products that we can start using today, right? They're available on the website. So this is a map, a snow water equivalent off the White River National Forest. So if you do all the drop downs, you can select the sort of the measure that you want, and you can plug this right into a lot of your discussions right now. Yeah, so that climate change mapping tool is super awesome. So you should check out that. There's other. I see Claire's actually joined, so I'm glad I mentioned the RPA. So she posted a link to the website of the group. But anyway, so these tools are readily available, and there's folks. Charlie Lewis, I think, had a big part of engaging this project. Give him a call. He's sort of a hero of mine when it comes to climate change and water. I think I saw Gisun out of the Southern Station might be on this call too. The tools out of the Southern Station, the WASI modeling group is phenomenal and has a suite of climate change resources. So you can think of this part of the presentation as resources that are out there, contacts that you may want to make over the next sort of period of discussion related to climate change. There's not enough folks out there talking about what climate change means on the landscape or to our user groups. This is, again, results from this iteration of the RPA, looking at this idea of drought, but what we call socioeconomic drought or water shortage. Where is there likely to be less water than people want? And this data is available. It's a complicated slide, so I'll kind of go through it. As you go from the top to the bottom, that 1 month, 6 month, 12 month, the rows, that's the duration of shortage. So how long essentially is a community likely to be without the water that they want? And generally we make up for those shortages by things like reservoir, by things like mining groundwater. So that's kind of moving down. Moving to the right is that sometimes called the return interval, or that kind of frequency. If you think of the 50-year drought, it's that kind of statistical return period of the drought. Municipalities often plan for this 50-year shortage or this 50-year drought plan. So if you think of that middle column is often maybe the planning horizon. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that the amount of water that will be short on average will be greater. There'll be more water that we have to kind of account for in things like reservoir. It's going to cause more groundwater mining, for example, return to groundwater depletion under sort of status quo assumption. So this highlights where we're likely to move into adaptation more so than mitigation when it comes to water and climate change. So if you're interested in this type of information, certainly reach out to me. What can you do with it on a smaller scale? There's very few of us that do that are so interested in national scale issues. Here's a map of Region 4 that great grad student, he's moved on now, but the work is certainly there and available for folks that you're interested in, is mapping that to the actual users, because ecosystem services is all about the users and the people that might be dependent on that, our stakeholders, for example. Municipal water systems are a huge part of my work and a lot of the Forest Service partnership work. And we can say each of these dots on this map are water intakes, so where utilities might withdraw water for municipal water use. And we can map those changes in water availability to where it might impact the people that want it. Here in Region 4, we see that sort of front through that central Utah. Areas that are high risk, those communities are likely to experience in 2040 and 2080 relatively high degrees of risk to their water system and the water supplies. Areas of the state or areas of the region that are going to need a lot more adaptation options, a lot more reductions in their water use. Lots of stakeholders out there. Sometimes the data varies in spatial scale. When you deal with economics, socioeconomic data is part of the game. Here's a picture for out of that same work for Region 4 on vulnerability of livestock driven through changes in water. So I put this one up there because it's a nice sort of example of maybe where partners or user groups might be different. There's not going to be a lot of grazing in the metro areas that are drawing out water, but certainly in the rangelands and the plains, it's likely to be, right? So I think maybe the point of this slide is to think a little bit not just where water is likely to be short due to precipitation, but who cares, right? Having lots of water where the users aren't is less useful than having water where the users are. So, and certainly for things like agricultural statistics, unfortunately, that's at the county level, and in the West, counties are huge, but tying that back to the users is super great. So this is work with Matt Elmer. Elmer is the name of the student. Chris Miller is with EMC, and Matt Reeves also at RMRS. So if you're looking for resources related to adaptation, I can't talk enough about the regional threat assessment centers, both adaptationpartners.org and forestadaptation.org. Have a tremendous amount of resources where you can drop down. Again, you can do a menu-based approach to the ecosystem service that you're interested in, let's say water, and look at adaptation options around some of those resources. So check out those either for WETAC in the West or NIAX in kind of the North and the East. So well worth checking out. Going to move a little bit to a relatively short, underserved discussion of watershed health, and try to convince you, or at least maybe give an example of the way we might talk about both risk and values in the same discussion. So that's kind of where I live my life and my career. So going to do it with an example for the Colorado Front Range. In general, we're relatively good in this agency about talking about risks. There's lots of maps out there. This is a screenshot of a story map that's kind of in process of development. But we have lots of data about road density and housing density, fire potentials, mining, all these sorts of things that generally cause risk on the landscape and might cause pressure to our watersheds. Probably my favorite place to get risk-based data, especially if you're working with municipal water groups, is Forest to Faucets. The 2.0 version of it is phenomenal. Lists a wide range of threats out there, wildfire, land use change. I believe there's invasive species and insects and pests on there as well. So Forest to Faucet stuff is phenomenal when it comes to mapping risk. We probably all have our favorite ways to do that as well. My challenge to you and to the agency is to move that a little bit into what does it mean and maybe a more fine-grained discussion of risk. I looked at this map and I was just like, well, if you're in Northern California, you're kind of out of luck. Like, I don't really know what to do with a map that shows like all of the West at high risk of something, right? Like, what do you do with that? It really is great for motivating a national discussion, but hard to motivate an ecosystem services discussion. So if we wanted to move human values into some of these maps or some of these discussions about watershed values, one way to do it, probably the most popular way in the literature, I would say to do it, is to do some sort of ranking. It could be or quantification that could be driven by qualitative measures of the quality of the watershed. You can talk about, so one, I would say that this is completely made up data. If you know these watersheds, don't get hung up on these numbers. But for each of the HUCs, so for each of the watersheds, you can list out the things that you think either community members or you as an agent, as a land manager, might care about. So this one I took recreational fishing, carbon storage, and drinking water. I like these because even if you're targeting one, it moves us into a discussion of what are called co-benefits, the things that you get in addition kind of as you manage for one of the resources. So sometimes if you manage for recreational fishing, it's likely that drinking water improves. It's possible that carbon storage is included. When I show slides like this or these discussions, the folks in the ecosystem services world, certainly the economist, always say, whoa, 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 you need to have discussion about the supply and the demand. So the supply of ecosystem services is generally the capacity of the landscape to provide the resource. So in something like recreational fishing, where in a stream are the fish, for example, right? That might be the supply side of the discussion. And the ecosystem services sort of moves it a little bit more to say, okay, so here's where the fish are, but where are the people fishing, right? Where are those two meeting? And you can map out both of those. You can list places that are where there's that heavy supply of the ecosystem services, as well as where there might be heavy demand, and see where those intersect, which is super useful. How do you get to these 0, 1, 2, 3? So I arbitrarily chose this designation. In this case, I said 1 was sort of a low value or low quality, maybe the ecosystem services, 2 was middle, and 3 was high, where 0 might be where it doesn't exist. So so these types of metrics are easy to do, relatively easy to do, and super popular and super useful. It's an easy way to get ecosystem services on the same maps that sometimes the risk levels will. So here's what a map of that might look like. So here I've done angling demand. You can tell that this is made up data because there's heavy demand kind of out on the grasslands, which I'm not saying that grasslands don't have a lot of angling demand, but anyway. And then how do you sort of talk about ecosystem services that occur in the same space? I don't think it needs to be overly complicated. Generally, the literature I read is not. You can add them up. You can add up all the scores of the ecosystem services and just see where they like kind of stand out, and then have a more nuanced discussion about it. In this case, I just took the average of the ecosystem service score. So this is for the angling, climate, and drinking water. So this is pretty easy to do, pretty easy to engage with someone like me and on the research side, or someone in probably the regional offices have this capacity sometimes, hopefully, if it doesn't exist on the forest. But widely popular in the literature, super helpful, meets a lot of the needs of the stakeholders. And I like it because we can start having more discussions like this. So it just turns out of the random kind of collection of data that I put, that if we were only to focus on the risks, so these aggregate risks to watersheds, what we get is something that, like, the high value angling sites, only 5% of them are at high risk. So if our goal was to reduce risk for the sake of reducing risk, we're only going to target 5% of the well, okay, this is 5% of the watersheds that are high value. But you know, is it more important to address the 20% in that high value angling that are medium risks, right? I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a discussion for land managers involving stakeholders. Is it important to address high value ecosystem services, you know, or high levels of risk? I mean, of course, we're doing both of that, and I'm completely oversimplifying the way folks handle risk in this agency. I know that this is mostly for illustration purposes. A lot of folks are probably looking for metrics in specific places to start. It's hard because it involves some kind of partnership discussions. Me, personally, I like kind of multiple choice tests more so than essay, at least when I'm not familiar with the topic. A great place to start is a lot of national or international metrics around ecosystem services. So the EPA has this thing called the Final Goods and Services Metrics Report, or FEGS. If you Google that, you'll get something like, looks like this spreadsheet, and it's got like hundreds of ecosystem services on there. You can sort them by aquatic or water-based, recreational, who the user group is. So I pulled up, this is recreational angling, for example, and it lists actual metrics. So the metrics for this one is presence, richness, and abundance of desirable fish. It lists a database that has a lot of this information that you can draw from. What I've mostly been told of the folks that use FEGS is you either love it or you hate it. It does bound the discussion and moves you towards a more specific, maybe metric than sometimes we want as we start to introduce these regional values. So I offer it as a place to start, if not necessarily a place to finish, kind of up to the people doing the work. And of course, in the Forest Service, we have this wonderful watershed condition framework, which I think has a meeting right now that this webinar might be competing to. So hopefully they're recording that one, because I'd love to hear where the watershed condition framework is going. We're already assessing watersheds for things like the aquatic and physical health of the watersheds, right? There's things that are going through. So it might make sense as an agency to start the watershed condition framework and build up from there. I haven't talked so much about economic values. Maybe people were expecting more of that. I don't really know. I find it's not always necessary or useful to talk about dollar values when we talk about ecosystem services, but it turns out the agency has a rich history of it. So folks just a few doors down from me literally wrote the book on non-market valuation. The group that I sit in is now called Human Dimensions. It used to be called Heavy on Valuation. So Patty Champ, Tom Brown are all on my hall. The agency has lost a lot of capacity in valuation. It's a place that I think we're short of. Hopefully we're building back. Sonia Kolstow is the NESST member who is probably the most versed in non-market valuation. So if you have a non-market valuation question, reach out to her. She's relatively new to the agency, and I'm sure would be glad to engage with you. There is also something called the USGS Benefits Transfer Toolkit, which is super cool. What they've done is taken a bunch of stuff from the literature and distilled it into kind of regional values. So for example, in the Intermountain West, freshwater fishing, a day of freshwater fishing comes to about $79 a day. So check out the USGS Benefits Transfer Toolkit. That value is based across sort of an average statistically different of freshwater fishing, 260 studies. I'm going to leave with a little bit of a caveat. So one of the frequent questions I get as a Forest Service economist working on water is, what's the value of a healthy forest for something like water treatment costs? And it's very obvious to us, probably, hopefully, that healthy forest, although I've been told it depends on the region you're in, healthy forests generally lead to healthier waterways, right? So reduces things like sediments in the water. If you worked with any water utilities, or if you sort of think through the process, it makes relatively good sense, I guess, that clean water is easier to treat. It's less costly. This is why our partners engage with us. This is folks, these are the two parts are relatively well understood. In my work, I've tried to go from how do you go from forest to cost, just to make that leap. Turns out those are widely complex systems. That forests are complex. Water treatment is super complex, and we may not have the data to put dollar values on that direct link. And I don't think we have to. I don't think we should let it hold up management. I don't think we should let it hold up engagement with stakeholders. I think it's okay to go forward without monetary values for a lot of what we do, because sometimes they're really hard to measure. Gonna leave with a sort of a call to action. Where are we going from here, both as NESST and myself, because it relies on you to some degree. So one, let's move to the right of that discussion, or the right of this slide. Let's talk about human values as often as we talk about risk. Let's talk a little bit more about what's at risk. There's a lot of concern that ecosystem services are about commodifying nature, and I think that's not right. It's not always about putting economic values on nature, but recognizing that nature has value and putting that into our perspectives. There's national, international groups that do something called natural capital accounting that puts, actually, if you think about like GDP accounts, things into national accounts for things like GDP, adding nature into that, and I think it's likely to be a big part of what I'm to do in the future. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, case studies are always super fun and interesting. So reach out to me with some of that work. So with that, thanks. I don't know. I like Alice in Wonderland. I think it's a daunting task, but I don't think it's one that we are not able to achieve. So with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to discussion.
Well, thanks so much, Travis. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to now look to my colleagues, Lara and Sherry, who are also on the National Ecosystem Services Strategy team, to see if there's some themes or key questions that we can call out in the chat. What do you think, Lara and Sherry?
So, Lara, if you don't mind, I've got one here from David Ritchie, and he's asking, how do you reconcile or describe the often distal effects of management actions on endpoints such as water quality? If there's an obvious source, it can be easier to justify actions than when there are broader conditions and not specific actors.
Okay.
And Travis, if you like, we can invite David to come on camera and / audio.
Sure. Yeah.
David, thanks so much for joining. Great to have you on here. But if you want to elaborate, David, feel free.
I was mainly just so referring to your slide where we're wanting. So this is not a question for the right-hand side of the slide, which is where you're wanting to move the discussion. But on the left-hand side of this slide, often when we're trying to take management actions on the landscape, If we are looking for some sort of cost-benefit justification, it's very difficult to tie any particular action, especially in, say, a broad watershed or a large watershed, let me say, to some sort of endpoint action. And therefore, I appreciate your comment that we should try and avoid that, but often in discussions of prioritization or in sort of the, if your utility has a board, for instance, in board discussions, it's like, well, we're putting money for this. What is it going to get us on the endpoint? And it's a very hard discussion.
Oh, 100%. I feel like the conservation folks are wrestling with this nonstop. It's probably a discussion for some of the hydrologists on here. One thing that I have found is also that when we limit the discussion to a single user, so what's the value to a water utility, for example, turns out that treating forests, improving forest health is super expensive, and it's not always, the cost is not always greater than a single benefit. So also moving that discussion into multiple benefits is worthwhile. But yeah, how to get to these diverse impacts, I don't know. I think that's an interesting topic. I don't know if folks have insights on that. Yeah, I don't know. I struggle with that as well.
So I think that Laura has another question.
Great. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight Brian Ratcliffe's question there kind of towards the end of the chat. He was asking if you could elaborate, Travis, on why the correlation between forest health and water treatment cost is so noisy.
Sure. Well, one for that same question that first came up, right? Like, how do you directly relate change in forest health or to water quality? And it's tricky. It depends on, things like precipitation, things like, the other things that we tend to manage for, right? So the variance just in that, so if it was a statistical regression, for example, right, there's a mean, but then there's variance around it. Well, when you look on the water treatment side, then it depends on things like, are they over treating to sort of meet some standards, right? So if they're they're legally required to meet standards, so they do their treatment, their chemical or mechanical treatment to do that. It can't be completely variable all the time, or else, I mean, treating water would be a headache, right? That would be super complicated. And there's different ways to treat it. There's different technologies across the different systems, different ways communities have done it. So I think that it's variance on one side, so on the water treatment side, and variance on the watershed side, and just the additive variance, I mean, just makes a noisy signal.
Thanks, Travis. I see Brian's hand is raised, so I'm wondering if you might have a follow-on or complimentary comment to offer, Brian? Brian, did you want to chime in?
There we go. Can you hear me
Perfect.
now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I forgot I had to do the star 6 thing because I'm calling in. Yeah, thanks, Travis. Really appreciate that elaboration. I'm curious. So I'm thinking about the Forest Resilience Bond in California and the way that they're, one of the major payers into that product, that conservation finance product, is the water utility, and they're looking at avoided costs for like dredging reservoirs and things like that. That's obviously slightly different from water treatment. So I guess there's a number of dimensions there, a number of ways that you could connect forest health to water health, sort of more broadly conceived. And so I'm curious if you've looked at that, or if that particular study was just narrowly focused on, at the water treatment plant itself, the marginal cost there of different treatments.
That one focused on the water treatment itself, so the chemical costs related to things like sediment. Did notice, if he wants to chime in, that Jonas Epstein is here, and he's the one I go to for all these questions. He's certainly well versed on how do you turn a healthy watershed into a measurable impact for a community. I'll rely on the dialogue part of this discussion.
Sure, Brian. For that particular instance, I think you're referring to the Yuba Water Partnership. They focus mostly on water retention and reduced evapotranspiration. So essentially it was a coefficient that they used when they did meadow restoration in that watershed. They applied the coefficient based on the basically thinning to keep water in the system. And then the business justification was made not for the water quality treatment side, but for the water retention side of the equation. There's a confidence interval there, and it is still dependent on atmospheric conditions over time, but it was a reasonable enough estimate, and Yuba Water had seen wildfires in the past degrade that landscape to the point that they were willing to invest and cost share that with other payers. So there was a water retention benefit that was justifiable, and that also, like Travis had mentioned earlier, was not the only benefit category or beneficiary that was engaged. So CAL FIRE had also cost shared in that particular partnership model because they saw the benefits of avoided wildfire risk reduction. So when the benefits are diffuse, even if the source of contamination or avoided contamination is further away, you can still make a justification for investment. But I will say in the forest resilience bond context, we have not yet economically justified water quality treatments as a revenue stream for that financial model yet.
So Nicola, I've got a question here from Gordon Grant, and he might want to unmute. I'll just read, Gordon, what you have in the box here first, if I can get that cursor going correctly. Here we go. You emphasized, let's see, sorry, the places where there's good alignment between one type of ecosystem service and another, for example, fishing and water quality. But it seems to me that the real issue arises where ecosystem services do not align. For example, forests represent the single largest consumers of precipitation. And sorry, the cursor does not, it's not being friendly. Gordon, did you want to come on off of your mute and share your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate that. And sorry, it was a long-winded question as usual. So Travis, thanks for what you've given us. I'm interested in, though, and it seems to me in most of the discussions about ecosystem services, we emphasize, and this was sort of the last questioners who had the same theme in mind. We tend to emphasize this idea that, forests are sort of good things for water. But that all depends on how you look at it, because in terms of returning precipitable water back to the atmosphere, forests are the single largest consumer by far of water. They eclipse agriculture, everything we do in the landscape, totally eclipsed by forest, quote, consumption, which of course is necessary if you're going to keep a forest around. My question really is, how do ecosystem service thinking reconcile the issue that, if you're going to keep water on the landscape for the purposes of trees, and then hence all the other water quality, et cetera, benefits that are derived from that, how do you reconcile that with the way people, I think, often want to sort of frame the issue in terms of water delivery, that we're going to get more water if we hold the forest, which isn't true. But it seems to me that kind of falls through the cracks sometimes of the ecosystem service argument. How do we reconcile those different, non-aligned downstream use versus retaining water on the landscape?
Yeah, I think, one, I think that's kind of the point of ecosystem services, is to recognize that there are multiple values and whether or not we as an agency are managing to the right one. So the forest and water one is tricky because my naive understanding of the science is that we don't always know, kind of what happens on different timescales for related to the amount of trees on the landscape and the water in the river, right? Like what that sort of means, at what scale it matters. Certainly there's folks who know a lot more about it than I do. The other part of that, though, is that if you just take two ecosystem services that are opposed, And if you're not talking to the stakeholders about what matters, then one, we should do that. And if you're getting a different message than the way we're managing, then that's a different discussion, right? So I mean, if the community says cut down the trees because we want the water, then that's sort of that's sort of a crazy discussion to begin with. But you never know. Like maybe it's one that we need to have. So I guess the short answer is that if we don't address ecosystem services and a discussion about values, how do we know if we're managing to what people want? And should we be managing to what they want? Yeah, there's no, I mean, so there's also an economic answer that marginal returns should equal, like we should like increase one and decrease the other till those values are kind of reflected in people's preferences. That's kind of the econ techie way to say it. But I think the other is just that it opens the discussion.
If I can just respond to that, I agree with you that it's an important discussion to have, but I think we often sort of have this notion that it's, in a sense, we're whistling past the graveyard because people have very competing notions of what they want. Sure. And they're equally, justifiable. So the issue then becomes who gets to decide. And right. Of course, we decide because we manage, but presumably we're listening. So I understand your point that we should be using this as a framing for how we listen to things. But I also think that we should be more cognizant and more articulate and more humble in the face of the fact that it may be difficult to reconcile these different objectives. Thanks.
And recreation is certainly where this comes up too, right? I mean, you can't have both OHV and wilderness in the same place. So,
hey folks, I might be able to provide a little bit of an answer to Gordon if I may.
Sure.
Hey folks, Dave Levinson in Fort Collins. I'm the WO National Program Lead for the National Stream and Aquatic Ecology Center. My office is right down the street from Travis. And but I know Gordon, Dr. Grant. Your question also hits at in-stream flows and in the regulatory environment that we live in with water. So I'm not the expert on the staff that does this, but Dave Merritt is our natural riparian ecologist, and he does quantification of flows for forest resources as part of our wilderness and wild scenic river work. So if it involves wilderness and wild and scenic rivers, there is a comprehensive river management plan, and typically there's a Federal Reserve water right to maintain certain flows for forest resources. Okay. And so there is a regulatory framework here as well. And this is an incredibly complicated thing, as you can imagine, Gordon. You probably know some of this already, but the point is when you are submitting under the Wilderness Act or the Wild and Scenic River Act, how much water does the forest need? How much water do plants need? How much water does flora and fauna need? How much water does fish need? Okay. And so typically that is dealt with through both the states as well as Federal Reserve water rights through in-stream flow quantification. And so what I would suggest here is the ecosystem services folks really should be coordinating in some ways with those working on in-stream flows, because there is a relationship here of providing ecosystem services through river flows that are adequate at maintaining our resources. But it typically only and mainly occurs with Federal Reserve water rights on wilderness and wild and scenic. Okay, so I'll leave it there. But Travis, I'm more than happy to connect you with Dave Merritt, who does all the in-stream flow work on our staff, and he can provide a lot of background. It tends to move around based on adjudications with river systems. Okay, so anyway, I'll leave it at that. But it's a great question, Gordon. I'm not surprised it came from you, because I know you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
I'm not necessarily seeing other questions in the chat. Laura, do you have one queued up that you've been holding on to?
There was just a broader thought question, which, given the timing, perhaps we could take. It was from Tanya Illersek. Just kind of a throw out to all of us, those that are part of the NEST group and those that are just involved in ecosystem services work. And this is just really a broad brush, but if there's anything that you wish agency leadership would consider, my words, and or maybe prioritize in regard to ecosystem services. Would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm going to give my answer, and then we can do a round robin. There's a lot of folks, USGS has been leading out, I think, on natural capital accounting, about putting ecosystem services in naturally consistent frameworks and things like that look like these GDP accounts, so that you can manage around it, so that you start to incorporate ecosystem services and natural capital into it. So it's called natural capital accounting. At least the folks that I know USGS seems to be leading out these days. I think the agency has fallen well behind in where we are with ecosystem service stuff. So my hope over the next year is to get more engaged with that community and to drag the Forest Service along with me. So and to really put that sort of work onto national forest lands. It's all the DOI stuff is there. They've done a really good job of it, and we have been missing from that conversation. Other folks?
Yeah, this is Sherry, and I actually just have a comment to that, Travis, which is this connects back to conservation finance. When you actually are able to get the agency to come along with that, that is super valuable information that can attract, frankly, hordes of partners, as long as we're able to provide the granular level of measurement that they're using and that they understand will meet their internal mission goals or the regulatory goals they're dealing with. So that's a very valuable effort for this agency.
So I'm going to be the grumpy facilitator and acknowledge that we're almost at time, but really, really appreciate the rich dialogue and the incredible subject matter expertise that's on this call, including some of our partner organizations. So really appreciate that. And to the great question that Tanya raised, we actually have a related poll. So I know folks will soon need to transition to their next call, but Katie has prepared a poll about topics of interest for future dialogue. It's also really clear to me that there's a lot of rich and important discussion related to this topic as well. So I would task our team with thinking that through and suggesting some next steps. But before we formally adjourn, anything else that any of our team members would like to address? Or Travis, any closing thoughts?
No, this has been awesome. I'm super great for everyone joining in, and reach out to me with future work and ideas.
Yeah, really appreciate the excellent questions and dialogue. So thank you everyone for joining. If you're interested in engaging with our team in the future, reach out to any of us at any time, and have a very good Thanksgiving if we don't connect before then. So take care, everyone.